Well, first off, I'd like to thank Bellona for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. Congratulations, Frederick, and the members of Bellona, and all those who've worked with Bellona over the years. I have worked with several different NGOs from around the world, and especially in the United States. And as you might have gathered from Frederick's discussion in the beginning, somewhat impassioned, that there's a difference about Bellona. And that's one of the reasons I'm very pleased to be here. And the biggest difference is many NGOs are very aggressive and actively in the information and policy influencing or lobbying. Mostly they like to say no, rather than how do we get to a meaningful future. The science base, many of them do the research in the sense of studying and doing analysis of others' reports. Bellona actually does research, Bellona actually does projects, and so they can speak from both an intellectual understanding, but from a pragmatic comprehension, and I think that makes a very big difference in how you go forward, and I applaud that, and I appreciate being part of it. I was asked, I am not in California, I happen to live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but 5 years ago when I was the director of the National Energy Technology Laboratory, I had the opportunity to begin to work more aggressively with some of the leadership in California, the Utility Commission President, the Chairman of the Energy Commission, the Chairwoman of the Air Resources Board, and begin to, although it started as a little rocky conversation, we had a conversation about where they were going, my observations of where they were going, and about carbon capture and sequestration. And we ended the discussion with, well, I just want to give you the information as I see it. If you want to be shivering in the dark, that's your call, go for it. They took all the information back, they read it, they looked at it, and they said, well, we hate to tell you we think you're right, but you maybe are right. We don't have enough to get to where we need to go as far as this whole carbon issue we're trying to get to. And so we started to have dialogues and meetings out there, engagement, and they began to recognize that carbon capture and sequestration is not a coal technology, it's a carbon tool for management and mitigation of carbon impact. It is not the answer, it is one of the contributing answers. And when I retired from the National Energy Technology Laboratory as director about 1.5 years ago, they called me up and asked would I be part of a panel. And then they called me up a month later and said, would you be the chairman of the panel? And foolishly I said yes. And it was a very long year last year being part of the panel, which was a pro bono opportunity, although they did at least give me to travel back and forth to the States. So with that, I'll move into my presentation. And the question I was asked to speak on is U.S. climate change leadership, California's role, is it hope or illusion? And the answer is yes, so we're done now. But it's not that simple as yes or no, as you'd expect. And the answer is both yes. So the hope and yes in part sometimes is an illusion, but it is illusion in the sense that we all have wishes and visions we want to get to, but along the way they have to deal with reality and they get modified. So it's not illusion truly, but it's vision. This chart behind me shows the projects for California in the sense of the process. California, and why did I want to work with them 5 years ago? Because in the United States, first off, California is a very large and financially wealthy state, and they are also extremely aggressive or progressive, depending on how you like to think of the terms, about dealing with the environment. So my view was if I could work with California to get them to deal with the greenhouse gas in a way that might have reality of accomplishment rather than an argument about regulation and policy, perhaps we could get the rest of the country to start to think about those things as real. So as you think about what Paul said about the European Union, in the United States, what California does has a great potential to affect what the rest of the nation does, because first of all, they have a very large members of the House of the Congress, because they're the largest state by population, basically, and they have a great influence there. Plus, they're very aggressive about how they approach things, even to the point of making mistakes sometimes, but the rest of the country can learn from and then do the right thing along the same way without having to go through the pitfalls. So this chart shows way back over on the left-hand side, just around now, 20% energy, with 20% of that energy being biomass, 20% renewable portfolio standard. I think the fact of putting a high number of that standard to be biomass dependent is a very interesting challenge, and that is not readily achieved yet in California. It's good to put out objectives. It's bad when they become regulations and you can't meet them. But when you put them out as challenges, maybe you can stretch towards them. And California is stretching towards them. forecast demand reduction, rooftop photovoltaics. They have a lot of warehouse facilities in Northern California. Many of them are getting photovoltaics on their rooftop. In one sense, that helps a great influx of photovoltaics. And I'm not speaking as a government official here, either for California or the U.S., so that's my own personal opinions. I just would like to share that with you. The downside of it is, while it helps the production, it also winds up having an investment in capital in a technology at the state that it's put up there in commercial scale. That means that if it improves in 2 years, there may not be the capital to put the alternatives up. So you're kind of guessing you're there, when in fact you may not quite be there at the best technology point. And so it's a real balance of putting too many of your eggs in one basket and not having the capital to replace the whole basket of eggs with a new basket of eggs. So it's good, it's incentive, it moves it along, but it also sets up potential downstream obstacles, financially at least, of going with the replacements. And that's the same thing when you think about fossil fuel plants. There's a large amount of capital tied to fossil fuel plants. There's a large amount of energy that we depend on from the fossil fuel plants. So how do we get to the future without just turning the lights off in between? And oh, by the way, you can't make the economics work because you need the energy we have coming to generate the economics to have the energy for the future. So it's finding an appropriate transition slope that is a very difficult challenge. So California has set up these goals, and moving through them, went through cooling. Some of these things are up there. I put them up there because they have impact. We don't talk enough about water as we talk about energy, but I'll just give you an example of why it's so important. In California, 13% of their total electricity consumption is all in dealing with water. But that's not the bottom line. 30% of the natural gas consumption is also with dealing with water. That's a lot of energy in a very large energy consuming state. So if you don't think about water, you're missing some of the issues that have to be dealt with in dealing with climate. Also, if you have any kind of thermal generation, whether it's geothermal or solar thermal, as well as nuclear or fossil thermal, they all are water dependent because they're steam cycles. So if you don't have the cooling water to run the steam cycle, you have a reduced efficiency of that cycle. You can use air cooling, depending on your location. It may be fairly effective, or it may be less effective. High humidity and high temperature is not a very effective area for air cooling. I just put that up to say this. Now, I'm not going to belabor this chart much longer, but it's important to recognize that their goal out in 2050, right here, is an 80–85% reduction in greenhouse gas and emissions. So they're trying to get to the same place that Europe is trying to get to, but it's a lot easier to talk about 2050 than it is about 2020. Because really everybody who put that legislation in place, and probably myself included, will probably not be worrying too much about things in 2050. But in my case, I have 3 grandchildren, so I'm beginning to worry about 2070. Because they're going to be around very probably then, and I'd like them to have a reasonable quality of life, as well as other people around the world. So this is what their electricity mix looks like right now. And you can see a large portion of it is nuclear imports. We'll read imports as mainly fossil-based imports. They have a large couple of coal plants in the surrounding states that they import from in natural gas. So while it says 28%, probably of that 28%, 80–90% of it is fossil-based. So it's a CO2 burden. And then their own internal is largely natural gas. They have a couple of very large nuclear power plants. They have a law that they will not build any more nuclear power plants. And the Fukushima event has even reinforced their view of that law, especially since they're a state that lives on a fault zone. So this is where they are, and they are pursuing very actively. Now, the change of administration happened, as you may know, in California last year. The new administration is Governor Brown, who also was Governor Brown of quite a few years ago. One of the interesting things I've observed is an increased review of efficiency improvements and renewable portfolio standards that lead me to understand this. It's very important to have good information to make decisions on. And unfortunately, sometimes in the zeal of a moment, people who have an interest sometimes for the environment or sometimes for their own economic gain, push forward ideas that are not based as well in fact as they should be. And so Governor Brown came in with the opinion that perhaps even these aggressive renewable portfolio standards should be accelerated and maybe be even more substantial in 2050. The reality is that the technology isn't there yet. Can it get there? I think some things will happen. I'm actually involved with several other technologies that when they produce at scale like they do right now, they will be disruptive in a positive sense. Although they will have economic challenges because some people find their ox being bored by them. And that's another issue. So I bring that out because just having goals doesn't mean you've gotten there. And I think it's very important to be wise about how goals are set, not to set them so easy that they aren't a challenge, but not to have them where they can't be realized, because what happens when you get there is people become discouraged and they can decide they aren't going to do anything else because it's impossible. When it's not impossible, it just requires us to take our jackets off, roll up our sleeves, and work harder. So this is a big challenge. It's a lot of things. And I just want to give you a perspective. If you take all of Germany's nuclear power and all of Japan's nuclear power and say they're both offline now, which is almost reality, right? What does that equal to? That's equal to last year's total renewable energy in the world production, or 43% of what we have there. So what it would really say is the renewable energy would have to this year replace that nuclear energy by being 143% more productive than it was last year. That's a very big jump if you look at the track of renewable energy over the last decade. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying the scale-up issues get harder as they get bigger. I was in private industry. The board of directors gave me a goal of raising the revenue of the company by 25% every year. Well, the first 5 years, that was pretty reasonable. But then we started getting up into hundreds of millions of dollars, and it started to get very hard to win 25% of $100 million more each year. So my point is that the higher the number we have to get to, the bigger the challenge is going to be, because scale-up is a huge challenge. So AB 32 is not the answer, but it's part of the answer. AB 32 was the California law that addresses most of their greenhouse gas and renewable requirements for getting to the future. It was put in place in 2006, and it was being implemented, and I'll have a chart on that. AB stands for Assembly Bill, just in case you wonder what it means. And it's the Global Warming Solutions Act was the title of the bill in 2006, and it is in effect right now. And so to try to understand where we are, let's talk about that a little bit. A lot of things that the bill required have been met along the way. In 2009, the Air Resources Board, which is responsible for the regulations of emission in the state of California, was to provide a plan, and in fact they did, for greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now, a plan is not a resolution, it's just a plan, but they did it. In 2009 to 11, they would draft language and hold public workshops and measures, and they have done that. In January 1st of 2010, the early action measures began to take effect. Those were not limits on greenhouse gas, but certain things about renewable portfolio and other things. 2010, the ARB conducted a series of rulemaking workshops and public hearings about greenhouse gas, and regulations came forth. And on the January of this year, they completed their major rulemaking. They came out with a cap and trade. Now they have two other goals to get to, but we have to stop there. Now there's many portions of AB 32 that continue to progress on about renewable portfolio standards, limitations on emissions, 10% low carbon fuel improvements. But the cap and trade bill was stopped by a suit. And you might think the suit would be from the non-believers of greenhouse gas, but in fact it was not. The suit, well, some of you know, because you're shaking your heads like, yeah, right, why did they do this? The suit was what's from the community known as the environmental justice community. I'll just tell you what it is in case some of you aren't familiar with that term. Environmental justice is basically representing those low-income entities and families that live around industrial areas and really can't afford to move away. And so the idea is sometimes when we do things, the plans get passed or get some other way to work around them. has a detrimental effect and that the environment around the plant doesn't really improve, even though the emissions may improve elsewhere. And so that community has a disproportionate impact by how the rule is implemented. The environmental justice community felt that the way the Air Resources Board implemented the ARB 32 requirements through a cap and trade, and you have to remember when you file a suit, you have to figure out the way to file it. So the way they filed it was that the Air Resources Board had not done an adequate survey of various alternatives to cap and trade, and that the cap and trade approach that they took without doing the alternatives adequately would in fact result in refineries and utilities buying offsets, which would have been illegal in the cap and trade, at least for some of the early years, and therefore the environment around those plants would not be changed at all, and so it would be a disproportionate impact on the poor income families and communities around those plants. So the judge upheld that suit, and the ARB, California State, filed an appeal, which means that the punitive side doesn't go into effect until the appeal is heard. In the meantime, they're going back and revisiting all the things that they could have done instead of cap and trade, as well as cap and trade. And hopefully, in the next 12 months, they will come to remedy on the bill. Either they'll decide that they can prove that cap and trade is the right answer, or they'll modify how they're going to do it, or come up with another solution, and then move on down the line to cause things to be implemented. But it really is a point that sometimes you think the people who are on your side of the table are on your side, but it all depends on how you look at the problem that's on the table. And I think if there's a lesson out of that, and part of the lesson was there wasn't a very good communication with some of the people about what was going on, and so when the time came, they exercised their legal rights in the process and became obstructionists to what people thought they would be naturally positive about, because some of the money from cap and trade would have gone back to benefit those communities, but that wasn't communicated in any organized way, nor was it really planned in any clear way on how they would have been benefited. And so there was a big communications issue, and obviously you don't wait until things are set in concrete to say, wait a minute, I don't need my part in there. So that's how it is. So that's part of how it works, but it's a lesson to the federal level discussions about making sure we talk to people before we decide to put laws in place, and that's part of what the big arguments over the energy bills and the greenhouse gas bills at the federal level are about. Disagreements about disproportionate impact of some of the bills. And of course, there are those who don't fully, or even maybe at all, consider greenhouse gas and global warming to be a challenge, or at least not a challenge based on anthropogenic contributions. And you probably know that if you've watched that. So, while that's going on, the panel that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks also basically had a set of meetings to hold during that year, a set of papers, and I'll have a website at the end, and Bellona will have the website and this report, and you can publish it or put it out whatever you want. But there was a lot of very good papers in there that are well worth reading. They're technically quite sound, and there are some good policy insights. If you haven't looked at them, they're quite useful, they're well done. And the panel basically came through. But what's the most important thing is 5 years ago when I met with the folks I met with, they basically felt that CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, was purely about coal. And finally, 2 years into the meetings, they decided that one day the co-chairman of the Energy Council, California Energy Council, basically said to me, he said, so, are you saying that CCS is not a coal technology? And I said, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't care where the CO2 comes from. It just takes the CO2 and puts it someplace. And the issue is it's going to be stored properly and all those kind of things. So the panel went through, and we went through all those things. We looked at the bills, we looked at the science, and we basically came up with a recommendation. But the most important point is that the heads of the 3 agencies that are most actively involved with energy and emissions in the state asked for the panel. They got the governor to endorse the panel, and the legislative body to want the results of the panel. And so CCS is of interest to them. And that, I think, is a big change in California. So why is that important? The reason I tell you that is it's why California is important. The fact that California is willing to have a conversation now begin to consider CCS impacts the rest of the country's willingness to look at CCS in a very different way, including the Northeast, which doesn't have too many repository potentials for CCS. So those things make a huge difference in how the policy happens, how the regulations happen, and how the possibilities of alternative technologies happen. And I think Bellona and how they approach things uses that kind of approach of informing, educating, and making alternatives both considered as possible and then helping to prove the possibility is more than a possibility. It is a tool to be considered. So the panel went through it. We identified, the tasks were to look at what's going on, and I don't have the findings other than here, but I have a set of recommendations. I'll give those to you. You can have electronically. I'll discuss them. Basically, the panel was a very interesting. I give the credit to the agencies. They picked a former senator of the state of California. There was myself. There was Sally Benson, who's fairly well recognized as a geologist working at CCS internationally. She was part of the IPC. Ed Rubens is an admissions academic. He was also part of the IPCC report. There was somebody from two of the major utilities, the president of one and a senior member of the other. There was a he was the chairperson of the California Oil and Gas Association on the panel. And the point of this was there was a member from NRDC on the panel. And the point of that is they picked a very interesting mix of people. And it was really interesting getting these people to agree on what the findings were, but that was one of the benefits and strengths of it. No one could say it was all skewed toward industry or academia or NGOs. It was kind of a balanced panel, and we got through it and we came to the findings. So I think the findings were important that first recognizing there is a public benefit if it's done safe and effectively, but they need better standards, and standards aren't really set there. That's important in EU because they still don't have standards in agreement. Standards are important for two reasons. One is, how do you know you're doing it right? And two is, if you're industry and it's an investment decision, how do you know your investment is going to be sound? If I go do something and the regulations change and I have to change what I do, then I've invested money that may not get the consequences that the bottom line is required. If it's a publicly held company, that may mean your stockholders go elsewhere. And I think it's always an important consideration in discussions. It does have high costs, and is a regulatory complexity. In California, there's at least 4 major agencies and probably 10 minor agencies that have to be involved in getting permits in place. 2 agencies think they both have to be involved for 2 different permits for monitoring long-term storage. One because you monitor from the emission side, so it doesn't get into the air. The other because they're responsible for the geological side, so it doesn't leak out. One would suggest if it leaks out, it probably does go in the air. We probably agree and find one way through, so the company doesn't have to come up with 2 different permits and 2 different processes to do the same basic thing. But that was our recommendation to try to figure that out. They do need to have goals that are required, so they have a reason to point to why the investment should be made for the industry to go forward. And there needs to be a fund established for the long-term stewardship and monitoring and how that's dealt with. And at the federal level, Senator Bingaman had a bill a couple years ago, and in that bill, he had written into the bill, you might have worked on that at the time, Virginia, I don't know. Basically, they had 10 large projects in which the federal government would take care of the liability. But I know Allison was on this. Take care of the liability of long-term stewardship. But that didn't cover all projects, just 10. And there was a graded approach in how you do it. You obviously want the corporate to be responsible, but how long does their responsibility go? They should do it right. When they stop using the reservoir, there's a settling time. It has to be filed. You might be able to buy insurance for that, but you can't get open-ended insurance. At some point, there is a place for a major backstop to take place by probably the government, is the recommendation. So that's basically it. Now, a possible generation scenario. Why is this important? Well, here's a possible generation scenario if CCS is possible. You see that the California electricity would be almost 60% carbon-free. That's not with CCS. That's completely non-carbon-based electricity. That's really not true, but it's not fossil carbon-based. If you use biomass, it's carbon-based. I want to make sure you know the difference. But if you look to the right, it's kind of interesting. In the other 40%, it's largely natural gas and possibly some coal with carbon capture and sequestration. So one could suggest, going back to what Friedrich said in his talk earlier, that of that 60%, maybe 20% of that could share in the CCS with the coal and gas, so you have an economy of scale, and you go carbon negative. So that's a really simple discussion of carbon negativity calculations in the accounting process, but the reality is, if you're doing it, and you can do it at scale, you have the ability to take other things. So in the bridge to the future, if you're going to use CCS as part of the bridge to continue fossil fuels for some period of time, there is the opportunity to leverage biomass utilization, and that's being discussed out there as well. One other thing came out of that. Out of the report we gave, there was a bill put in by Senator Rubio in February 18th that was tabled, but it will be up this year again. Many of our recommendations wind up showing up in the bill. The AB 32 bill did not have anything but a mention of CCS because it was too far out in their mind. Our view is not that far out. The Senate bill begins to say, recognize CCS as a way to do this and bring it into the process more concretely and possibly to make it happen. And there are several projects planned in California as I talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate the time to be here and for the